Hi everyone, welcome to your next video lesson on working with oils and particularly looking at surfaces and materials. This one I think will be interesting because what we're going to look at are some lettuce leaves or a lettuce leaf. And this will challenge us because there's a lot of softer shapes and maybe slightly irregular shapes here and there. But as always, what we're going to do is follow this pattern of breaking our image down, looking at it, taking it apart, trying to understand how it's structured. And when you get that in your mind, then when you paint that, it's much easier and generally more accurate, if you like. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to bring up now the picture, or pictures I should say, because there are two. You can see here, one color, one black and white. Simply because when we look at these things in black and white, we can focus on the tonal relationships, the darks and lights, a little more easily. So by having both, we sort of get that wee bit more information. What I'm going to do is what I've done before is work through some of these words that we looked at. The first word with the S being shapes. Okay, so what I'm going to do, if you bear with me, I'm just going to move my own little image across out of the way. Don't really want my own face glaring at me, much as it's, I'm sure, very pretty. But I'm going to take a pen and just draw through these things. So I'm going to take some a pen and some white ink. Have a look at the shapes here. I'll work in the black and white image just first, but if you follow the main area of the leaf, you see a pattern emerge, and you see that, of course, I'm drawing on this now. You see the rhythm, obviously, of those wrinkles, and they're following a rhythm you can see coming from the main stem. So you can see there is a pattern to that, radiating from this big main stem up the middle. Then what we notice as we go a little bit further out, those shapes become slightly different in the sense that they become smaller and more like little cellular shapes. Do you see that? I'm making these sort of marks just to let us see the type of shape. And they're not all completely the same. Some of them are a bit longer, some of them are very circular, but you can see, so we move from this sort of rhythmic stripes almost into these little cellular shapes as the leaf grows and grows. And then as we get out to the outer edge, you can just see here in this one just about a little crinkly edge. And of course, that is, of course, one of the characteristics of the leaf, of course. So with regards to shapes, you've at least two different types of shapes within this area of the leaf here. And we're going to look at that when we start to paint. So, and that applies when we look at the other parts of the leaves. You'll see that pattern is similar in all of the leaves because it's a natural structure. So what I'm going to do is get rid of all of these nice little white lines that I put on, and look at the T of our stem, the word stem, S, then T, tone. This is why I've had this black and white one. And you can see that there's a range of tones, okay. Some of them very subtle, some of them dark, generally quite fairly subtle. There are occasionally very dark tones here and there, depending on how wrinkly things become in the leaf. They actually become a little bit darker out here in those crinkly cellular bits than they do in the stripes. But generally it's not an extreme black and white situation. The contrast isn't that high. So in other words, we're not going to be mixing up extreme black and extreme white very much. We'll have light and darker grays and darker greens, but not much else. So we've thought about the types of light and shade that we have here within the subject. And now what we'll think about is the edges. And for this, I'm just going to blow this up slightly. You can look at that. That's maybe a bit better. In other words, where one shape meets another, what are the edges like? And if we look up these stripes here that these sort of marks that I pointed out a moment ago, what you'll see, and I'll take these out, I just wanted to let you see, where one stripe meets another, it's a fairly crisp line. It's fairly, crisp line. Certainly there's crisp line along the main stem there. It's a very straight, crisp edge. These are reasonably crisp too. They're not absolutely, but they're very crisp. When we move out here to this area here, these crinkly bits, the edges, again, I'll just undo that. The edges are a little bit fuzzier, a little bit softer, because these are little bubbles effectively. So in other words, they're curved. These are more sharp ridges. These are more curved. So the blending of the gray, one gray to another, is more gentle and gradual. So that means when we come to paint it, that's what we'll try to do. We'll try to apply this. And the next word is M, marks. Are there any other marks or pits or structures or scratches or textures on top? And in a way, no, not particularly on this particular subject. It's not a rock or a piece of sand or a piece of old driftwood or something. It's quite a leaf is a smooth surface. It's not full of pits. So really, we're mainly trying to create these shapes and tones and relationships with regards to that. And we'll introduce color into this one because I think it's quite fairly important. So that's why the color one is here for you as well, to see how we can lighten and darken the colors and desaturate. I'll describe all of that to you. So we've broken that down. We've got to know a little bit more about this leaf and how it's built. And now what we're going to do, we're going to have a look and actually take some paints and recreate or interpret that structure in terms of what we do with our oil paints and our brushes. So just wanted, before you get started, I thought it might be interesting to work through some of the key colors you might use so that you can mix these. As I said on previous occasions, don't get too hung up on matching colors at this point in time. What we're trying to do is create form and texture and materials, okay? However, for this lesson, for this project, what I'm using is lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and white. So if we were to take our lemon there, and the thing about lemon is it takes very, very little to make it green. So I don't know if you can see on the end of that palette, there's a little spot of blue, ultramarine blue, and I'm putting that in now. And you can see already how that turns to a fairly strong green. Okay, and that would be a fairly, what I would term the medium green in this whole project, the middle green. So to get that middle tone, you don't need very, very, very much blue at all. And what we can do is add again a tiny amount of white, beg your pardon, titanium white. You can see here. Again, look, not too much. And when we add that, you can see it's lifting up the tone. So you get that nice, as I say, mid-green, and it's still fairly rich color. Now, if we want to dull the color, dull that particular color down a little bit, we add a little bit of crimson. And again, if we look at what's on my palette knife, I don't know if you can see, tiny little spot there. Put that in, mix that in, and you will see that this will become more of an earthy green, like not quite a khaki color, but a more of a what would be a sap green really, and possibly a more natural green. But that's the sort of green that begins to happen as greens go into shadow. Okay, so that will give you a guide as to what you could use. Let's go to the darker greens now. So if we want a really quite a strong green, we can start with lemon yellow again here and increase the amount of blue a little bit more. You can add it bit by bit, but it takes very little blue to suddenly turn yellow into quite a strong green. And you can see, hopefully, when I spread that, how strong that green is. That's really quite a deep green that's going on there. You can see as I scratch through it, you can see into the white palette below what sort of green it is. So that's really quite a deep green. But again, if we add small amounts of crimson, you can see there how small on the end of that palette knife, it will become even darker and more neutral. And you'll have a very nice deep green for the likes of the shadows in this project. Again, spreading it around so you can see just how strong that is. It's going to an earthy color again. If you add too much red, it would go brown. So, you know, just be careful of that. You can cool the thing down again with some blue, which I've got on here. So if I add blue into that, we get an even deeper, colder color. So when we get to the veins of this leaf, that's the sort of thing you might be wanting to use there. Okay. Looking at the lighter side of the greens, when you have when we come to look at the stem, which is sticking out and it's quite light. Again, if we start with our lemon, this time, you know, you can barely touch it with blue on the end of that palette. I don't know if you can see that. It's just barely touched. And you can see it's just turning it into slightly like a limey sort of green. And then again, bit by bit, add a little bit of white. So that lightest of lights that you might get in this picture will probably be something around that area there. So that's lemon and white with the tiniest piece of blue in there, you know. There's a little bit of blue. I don't know if you can see it in there. That's how little. And you see how that just generally moves it across a wee bit more to the green end of the spectrum. So in other words, if you want to warm something up, of course, you increase the lemon. If you want to cool it down, you increase the blue. And if you want to drain the color out and desaturate it, make it muddier and earthier, you add a little bit of crimson. So hopefully that will be some guide. You can fall back on this whenever you're actually making the picture itself. I'm going to begin now with basically mapping out the drawing of this leaf. So what I'm using is a little flat nylon brush, probably about number 2, number 3, with a little lemon yellow and ultramarine. Basically for this exercise, I'm going to use lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and a little bit of crimson, which will desaturate those greens, and of course white, because I want to limit the colors in order to focus on our exercise, which is all about the structure and the surfaces of the object. So we're not going to get overly bogged down with specific color, as it were. So what I'm going to do is I just want to begin to map out some sort of an image here. And I'm just doing this with the brush. You can, of course, draw out with charcoal or a pencil, whatever. But I do like starting with a brush. It's just one of my sort of things. I think when you start with a brush, you feel that you're painting right away or something, and there's a certain freedom to that, you know. So I'm just looking at the edges of this, and what I notice is that there's a crinkliness down the side of this leaf. So, you know, you look at the marks I'm making just to suggest that. Okay, so we're not photographers here, but we want to be some sort of observers, but not bogged down at this point in a photographic likeness. Otherwise, we use a camera. So we've got this sort of thing going on there. I'm just touching as I go down, just to remind me roughly where I want the perimeter, as it were, of the leaf to be. And now we've got this ghost of a structure. What we want to do is think about the way we analysed it earlier on, and the way we realised that there were certain shapes and patterns within the structure. And again, we're not going to reproduce every single shape from the photograph into this. That wouldn't make sense in terms of a creative idea. What we're trying to do is, having found out what makes that leaf look like that particular type of leaf, we're going to apply that sort of pattern to this leaf in order, hopefully, to do the same. So what the first thing we noticed, if you remember, was that there were a series of shapes radiating from the main stem. So these shapes weren't all, these patterns weren't all even, of course. So I'm just going to do this. Some of them will be closer together, these lines, some of them further apart, some of them a bit darker and lighter, although we're gonna think about tone in a wee moment. We don't need to worry about that right now. What we want to do is say, okay, let's get the feel of the sort of pattern that we have. And what I notice as we get closer to the top of the leaf, these patterns change direction. They went from being, pretty side on, they begin to move up at an angle towards the top of the leaf, so you can see that. So I've just made, and at the bottom they curl around a little bit, so I've just made a whole series of these lines going that way to represent that. On this side, the leaf is curled up a bit, so the lines that I'm seeing, the pattern, the rhythm, if you like, tends to be more this way, more acute. So we're coming more upright here, look. And again, I'm just putting these in as a reminder as to the shapes I want to create later on. And they get tighter together near the bottom here as well. So we've now got two sides of this leaf. One side's in shadow, actually. One side's a little bit lighter. The other thing that we noticed was when we got out to this outer edge of the leaf, the shapes turn from being rhythms and pattern or stripes, as it were, to being like little cells. So I'm just going to change the brush here. I'm going to use a little round brush for this to make it a bit easier to draw. I'm making up some more of my color. You'll see a list of what we need at the start of the video, but I'm just using a little turpentine for this. I'm not using really linseed or anything because it's an exercise. Turpentine thins this paint out, and we really don't need to thin paint overly much. There's a tendency to do that. Anyway, now what we are saying that we notice there are little cellular shapes. Okay, so let's make some cellular shapes, some little circular or not circular, they're not circular, they're different sizes. And of course, I'm creating these off my own bat, but it's on the basis of what I'm seeing in the photograph and what I remembered analyzing. So I'm moving my brush in that sort of crinkly way. Some of these little cells are big, some of them are uneven, some of them, but they are changing from the lines to the wrinkliness of the cells, okay, as we go right out to the edge. And they do go out to the edge because they kind of become part of the edge of the leaf. You can see here what I'm doing, and that line I did earlier is now being integrated into those little cellular structures there, okay. Some of them were quite big, actually. I've maybe made mine all very small, so we'll make a couple of bigger ones up here, so the shapes like that. So they're little irregular blob shapes, and that doesn't sound like a very artistic term, but if that's what helps you remember what it is you want to paint, then that's okay, So let's do some more of the blobs here. I could probably create a new art movement called blobism. I think that could be the trick. Become highly famous, the world's most famous blobist. So I'm not taking this seriously. I have to put myself together. So now you can see this sort of crinkly pattern that we've got on that side. And again, it happens on the other side to some extent, but it's much more difficult to see. And because this leaf has been curled back on itself, they're longer shapes, actually. They're elongated versions of these little cells here, it seems to me. So I'm going to make little long, moving from blobs to sausages. So sausagism could be another one. You see what I mean there, these long shapes, okay. Just going to turn the light away slightly so that that's not shining so much on with the oil. And some of these shapes are a bit bigger as we come down there, okay. So all we're doing with this brush is creating structures based on what we believe we saw in the photograph. And you can see already there's a certain quality that we're beginning to get from the leaf. And we haven't really started to apply paint full on just as yet. So we're going to do that in a second, because the second word that we talked about was tone. So what we looked at the variations of tones within the structures. Where's the lights? Where are the darks? Okay, so we're going to do that. We're going to try and mix up, and this is where we'll mix a few more tones up. This time what I'm doing, I'm going to be using a little small stubby flat brush here for this. Again, that's probably about 1/4 inch broad, no more. And I'm going to use that for occupying these stripes, as it were. And when I look at the photograph, I realize they go from light to dark, light to dark, light to dark, and so on. And there's a light dark rhythm, dark light, dark light. They're not all exactly the same like a zebra, but that's the general pattern. And this is what I'm trying to say. We're trying to find patterns and see things that have meaning to us. So what I'm doing is I'm mixing lemon, little ultramarine, and a tiniest speck of crimson. Tiniest little bit. I'm going to actually attempt to show you here what I'm doing there. There you can see the mixture, and I know cameras have a habit of not being too accurate, but you can see how the red has just taken the edge off that green, so it's not so severe. So what I'm going to do now is work some of these tones out here. So here and there, I'm working with the deeper tones first, actually, and I don't want these stripes to look all the same. So some are little marks, some are big thick ones you can see going right out like that. And that's what I notice. They're irregular. So I'm doing irregular stripes. They're not exactly identical to the photograph, but they are my irregular stripes. And therefore I should get my leaf, if that makes sense. And you can see working all the way up there, just simply following a pattern. Now, as I say, when we get up here, some of these shadows or darker stripes, as it were, become slightly thicker and longer. So let's do that for ours. And we'll just leave maybe at that for the moment. A few little taps, some of them come up to the edge and some of them don't. And then likewise, we'll take and make a little more of the same mixture. So it's about half and half lemon and blue. It's probably just slightly more lemon, but the little tiny bit of red, as you saw there, is just enough to stop it from turning into a lime green, if you know what I mean. Here, because this is in shadow, the radiating stripes are very thick, meaning that there's only small amounts of light. So in other words, there's more dark than there is light. So I'm going to make these lines radiate out broader, leaving a small sliver of light between them. And you can see I'm just literally painting stripes with a little missing gap, which we're going to occupy in due course, hopefully. And all of that's really quite dark. So really we're not really going to leave much in the way of space here, because really most of this side of the leaf is very, very dark. It seems to be anyway. I'm just making a little more paint up as I speak. And a tiny speck of red again. And right up to the edge, all of this is dark. So if you notice what I'm doing, I'm really saying we'll start with dark here on this side. And we'll occupy the light bits, whereas on the other side, you know, it's predominantly light. So you can see all the way up the edge there, this edge of this leaf. I'd like that to be quite dark, and just trailing them in towards the main middle stem, which, as you can see, or you saw in the photograph, is this quite light tone. So you can see now we're getting the dark side, the light side. Again, what I'm just going to do is slightly move this camera back so that we're not, so we can see we're not getting so much of a sheen actually from the oil. Now what I'm going to do is have a look at the lighter tones. So, sorry, beg your pardon. What I'm going to do is, while we have this dark, beg your pardon, what I'm going to do is actually begin to put some of those same shadows in these little cells. So while we've got that same color or tone, I'm going to do that. So I'm just mixing some of that up again and put my little smidgen of red in there. And this time what I'm going to do is look at those cells, and what we notice is there are little, like a ball, if you can see it over here, if I enlarge one, imagine that being one of these little cells here. What it is, imagine it being a little dome shape. So in other words, you might have a dark side to that dome, a little jelly bean shape going around the side, and the other side light. So it looks like a teardrop or whatever. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to occupy all of these with a little edging of this dark or darker green. So again, some of them are bigger than others. Keep dipping in there. And again, so they're all on one side. I've decided to kind of put them all towards the right side of each little cell. So you see there, they're little arc shapes all the way down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way through this and come back to the picture so that you don't have to watch me doing every single cell, okay? Now what I want to do, having created these little cellular structures across the leaf, I want to start to introduce and occupy these empty spaces with a mid-tone. So what I've done so far is using probably the deepest tone, the deepest shade of green in the object. What I'm going to do now is work towards a mid-tone and then work a light at the very, very end, or later on, I should say. So the mid-tone will occupy most of these empty spaces. And the mid-tone I've made up again, because we're only using ultramarine and lemon. You can see there, this is the sort of color I've got. Again, it's basically a bit warmer than the previous dark tone. In other words, there's a little bit more yellow in it, and of course there's a little white in it, of course, to lighten it. So as colors become lighter and more into the sun, as it were, they get warmer and of course lighter. As they go into shadow, they get cooler, darker, and less saturated. In other words, as we add those little bits of red, they become grayer. But now what I want to do is start to make put a color on that's slightly less gray, a wee bit richer. And what I'm going to do is just take, mix a little bit more of this, beg your pardon, here. So this is a little bit warmer now. I'm going to put some of this in here, okay, and occupy these stripes. And again, at the moment, it's a kind of a, a very simple activity, but we need to get rid of the color of the board. The board was just stained with a burnt sienna, very delicate wash of burnt sienna, actually. So in between these shapes, I'm using a little flat brush because the flat brush can cut in to these little sharp shapes, I find, more easily. So I kind of like that, and all the way up. And it's like most things in painting, it's only when we begin to get spaces occupied that we find our way into the thing, I'm going over this main stem, but I'm not worried too much because I know we're going to go over it again when we come to the even lighter tones, so that's not a problem. And again, remember that in this side, the dark side, this mid-tone, as it were, might be a darker mid-tone. In other words, this color with a wee bit more shadow in it, which I'll put in there in a second. But just at the moment, I want to spot it in amongst those little cells. Remember this little thing here. So really what I'm doing here is trying to occupy that bit with this color that I'm working with at the minute. So on the other side of those little curly stripes that I put on, I'm putting this mid-tone, so you can see it's there, and leaving that dark occupied as well. Dip in the brush, keep the brush loaded pretty well, because sometimes once we when we rub and rub to try and get more and more paint off the brush, and the paint's, there's no paint there, then all we do is rub all of the paint off. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm working fairly fast, obviously, because I wouldn't torment you with 3 hours of me talking and doing this. So apologies. I don't want to, as I say, because especially when we're repeating a certain pattern here. But you can see, hopefully, what's happening is that you see that there's a structure beginning to happen. It's all very, at the minute you can see it's very bitty, but that's the intention at the minute. That's what I want, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So what I'm doing is I'm into that mixture that I've just been using. I'm adding a bit more blue, cooling it down a wee bit, adding a little bit of red this time. Desaturation, of course, as I say, because this side is in shadow, or going towards shadow. So I don't want it to be, I want it to be cooler and less severe, less rich is the word I was looking for. So here you can see how that's quite a greyish tone. There's green in it, but it's, and occupying those little bits that I left earlier. So they're just a little bit lighter, but not much. Because, as I say, this is in shadow, filling those little spots and cells over this side and over that side. Okay. And I'm trying to also make sure that we, see if we can apply this idea of the STEM business, the shape, the tone, the edges, and the marks. And we're going to come to these other words in a second, but what we'll do now is look at the lighter tone. So I'm working basically three tones at the minute. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to get in the lighter tone, which is really, it's quite light. It doesn't actually have too much color in it, really. It is a little, very tiny tint of lemon. So I'm putting a wee bit of lemon. I'm actually putting the tiniest tint of crimson, believe it or not, in it. Just to warm it up. Again, I don't know if you can see this. There's my mixture there. And you see that lemon, what I've done is I've added a little bit of the crimson from over here, such a tiny amount, just to take it away from being pure lemon, if that makes sense, very, very extreme. But the center area, the center stem of this leaf is really quite light. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put a light area up the middle, just as a line. Okay, at the moment, very, very light indeed. I'm not going to the edges necessarily. I'll tell you why in a minute, because what I want to do is, as it radiates out, it gets slightly deeper and slightly more yellow. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put a line on either side of it, which is that little bit more yellow, and the same on the other side of it. So we've effectively kind of just made 3 stripes down the middle of that stem, and we're going to work these in a minute or two. Again, they look all bitty, just like the rest of the plant. And while we're on this nice light tone, then I know also that between the dark and light, there are some light highlights almost. So in here, you can see what I'm doing. Small highlights, some stretching out, some not. 1 or 2 emerge from the stem and then break and then come back. There are many, many ways to construct things in painting. So, what I'm always conscious of, I don't want people feeling that this method of painting is the only way you can do things. There are many ways we put paint on. You only need to look at the history of art to see how different artists have used different techniques. So, do keep that in mind. What I'm doing now is going out to the little cellular bits now. And again, just with the corner of this brush, you know, on the cells, I'm going to try and lift up little bits of highlight because the cells are raised up, you see, little bits like that coming in. So I'm just going to mix a wee bit more of that color, take a wee bit of the color out of it actually. So on in the middle of these cells, in other words, there is going a wee bit of highlight. In other words, that's a giant version of what I'm trying to do with these little cells. So, and again, it takes a little while, but, and they are a little bit dotty, a bit like myself probably, but a little bit of highlights here and there. And they all are quite separate. And what I want to do, and this is why I'm not putting the paint on too oily, because we want to try and pull these things together at some point. And again, on the other side, there, even though this is in the shadow, there are little bits of lighter tones. They may not be as light as the ones on the left side, but there are little highlights. So I'll just get a wee bit more white into that there. So here and there, there's a little bit of light just appearing, but not just as much because the light's not getting over there very much. It's probably what's called reflected light. Okay, so, and what I'm going to do now, having sort of created these different shades and tones and whatever, is just begin to pull them together. And this is where the word edge, the E, comes in. The edges, when we looked at the photograph, aren't hard edges. They sort of merge together. They grow into each other. They're not like rocks. So what I'm doing now is simply, actually with the same little flat brush, to be honest, I'm cleaning it. You can see I'm wiping pretty much. So what I'm doing now, I've begun to blend these colors, these bitty colors that I talked about earlier. What I'm doing is simply with this clean, slightly damp brush, but nothing more, flat brush, I'm just beginning to tease the colors together. And again, with a rag, I'm wiping it constantly. So you can see that the upper areas here, which are still very solid looking, as I approach into that and just work around the edges with this clean brush, I'm actually removing paint, really, is what I'm doing. You can see it going softer, almost out of focus as I work at it. And then I'm going into these little cells and I'm blending, as it were, this is my little example here. I'm trying to touch around the edges so that these areas become soft again, or soft. So it's just the slightest touch. I'm touching the canvas rather than stroking. You know, I'm not stroking in long strokes because then that will drag one shape into another. And you can see slowly work around the edges, wipe. Wiping is so important to this because, as I say, you are picking paint up. And if you don't wipe it off, then you're going to carry it to another part of the painting. And then it becomes, you know, very messy. But you can see how that's beginning to create a more gentle wrinkliness in these shapes that we put down earlier. And we'll work our way all the way around that. So what I'm going to do for a moment is work that up a little bit more and then come back to that. So I blended all of the leaf, more or less all of the leaf. The little individual sections I painted are now softened, literally to taking the edge off them. So you can see that there's a more of a gentleness within the movement of the paint. What happens though with this method is, of course, that because we're blending the paint together, we lose some of the nice rich colors that we had maybe at the early stages, and particularly the darker tones don't look as dark perhaps. So that's something I want to address. The second thing is that I realized that the little cellular shapes that I have here, to me, seem too even. They seem too alike, because I think they should be more uneven and varied, some bigger shapes, some smaller, and so on. So what I'm going to do is try to do both of those things. I'm going to make the patterns less formal, and I'm going to try and get a wee bit more variety into the shapes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up a nice, again, lemon yellow, very, very little blue in it, and I think I'll maybe go for some, a warmer tone. So I'm just doing that right now, and I'm going to apply some of these warmer tones in here. I'm still using this flat brush because I think it's working for me. It's giving me a crisp edge when I need it, and it's giving me a soft side when I want to blend. But anyway, as I say, I think some of these little cell structures, just going to take the edge off that. Actually, it's just a wee bit too warm for my liking. That's a wee bit better there. So these cell structures that I was talking about, I would like them to be, not all circular. So I'm gonna go back in and put a few more in. You can see there some long, some short, some a wee bit different, so they all seem to be happening at the edge as well. So you can see these more irregular little blob shapes. Back to the blobs again. And bring them on out there and so on, and right up here. So it's another blob. And then what I need to do is maybe reinforce those little dark shadows that we had earlier as well. So when I take the green again, on this time it's a much deeper green, tiny little bit of the red in there to subdue it, just to make it pretty neutral. And I'll just work with that. So we'll work around some of these shadowy areas here, around just like we did up here. So, and while I'm at that, I might actually use it as the opportunity to just strengthen some of those darks that I lost when I was blending. So I'm going to put right down in as it meets the stem there. Let that get really lovely and dark, because that's where the stem jumps out. So again, just following that pattern, not all exactly the same, some a bit thicker and longer than the others, and a couple up here as well. So just while we're at that, but then go back to the cells. Sound like I'm in prison there. Back to the cells, and go around the edges, like, as I say, that little one, and try to create a wee bit more variety there. And then we'll go back to the process of melding them together. So we're still using this word shapes first, then tones, dark and light, then edges. Let's merge the edges to make the edges as we feel we want them to be. So now, even at this stage, what I'm going to do, clean up the brush, dry up the brush, and just tap again, feather that in, soften that in, those edges. Wipe, tap, soften away that one, tap, wipe, wipe again, take the edge off that little hard yellowy green there. There's another harsh edge. Just soften it in and let it merge with the rest, and let that merge, and so on, all the way down, so that they all feel like they belong to the one leaf, which is what they should, of course. And take that on up there, and you can see that's beginning to just take a wee bit more shape. We'll just drag that one in and that one in. If a shape looks like it's out on its own, sitting on top, then you want to model it and meld it back in. And that way you can see that we're beginning to get a little bit more of a unified leaf. I'm going to just take the edge off some of these highlights here, and I'm doing that again simply by tapping into the wet paint, and I'm lifting away a little bit of paint. That's all I'm doing here, just so that there's less of the light on it, and it doesn't jump. I don't want those highlights just to jump too much right now. We can do that in a wee moment or two perhaps, and then if I want, we can go back to the dark side. The dark side of the leaf, I mean, not me. And maybe say, okay, let's get those little, like we did on the other side. These are going to be even darker and maybe more off it. So again, some of those stripes in there and in there, and again, they're just stripes. They're just variations of thicknesses and lengths of stripe. What turns them into something else is when I take the clean brush and feather them slowly as I did before there a moment ago into the rest of it. I'm barely touching this board, you know. I've said it before, it's like trying to flick dust off of an extremely valuable object. You're terrified that too much pressure will knock it over. So try to think of it in those terms. And then, as I say, yet again, of course, we lose some definition because we're blending the thing together. But then we go back again, and even sometimes it might mean that the painting is allowed to dry, and we go back and rub paint in. But as long as we're not laying the paint on super thick, we can go in and just lift out the nice highlights again, things that maybe we feel we've lost there because of the blending process. So just lift them up. This is, you can see a very light line with the edge of this little flat brush. I'm taking that up there and into the wee cells, cellular structures that we talked about, blending that and that, let that go on up. And again, when we get to the outer part, there are a few nice little lights there, but I don't want to overdo it, but there are a few little lights catching the edge of the leaf. So let's take courage and try to put a few little highlights in here. And we're going to blend those, of course, because you can see they look like they're kind of sitting on top. So that's our rule of thumb. We if they look too much like they're sitting on top, then let's soften them in. But just a few little bits at the edge where the sunlight or the light is just catching that edge there. Okay, and these little dots type things here. That's what we're kind of talking about all the way up. And then again, with our clean brush, or brush cleaned, I should say, very gently tap around the edges of those shapes I've just applied so that they soften in. They look like a little ghostly shape. And there, white brush, tap softly, tap again, wipe, and so on, so that there are no sudden changes, because that's what we saw when we analysed the photograph. And if that's what we saw, soft edges, then let's try and get soft edges, which is how we break things down. So we're beginning to get a more and more crinkly thing going on in that leaf. What I might like to do, actually, which I haven't done in this side, I haven't melded in that side of the big stem there. There are a couple of light bits, okay, still going in there, So I'm just going to cut those across, you see that? So that belongs to the same leaf. Cutting in that one and maybe taking it. I don't want to overdo it because I want to keep that nice and dark. And you can actually go fairly dark at this stage. As we develop the picture, we can say, well, look, you know what? There's some of these shadows are really rich and really very dark. So we can dramatize it. You as the artist can do this. So what I'm doing at the minute, actually, I'm mixing, it's really ultramarine blue to begin with, and a little piece of lemon. So the blue dominates. And then after that, a little tiny bit of red. So what I'm getting is a nice deep color there. Even I'm going to make it even colder. I'm going to put more blue in there, so we can get that sort of thing going on. And maybe let's say, well, you know what? Let's see if we made this leaf go back even deeper, as if it's curving around away from the light. So again, they look like patches, is exactly what they are. There and there, and right up to the top, perhaps. Maybe it creeps across there a wee bit anyway, and maybe in there. So actually, I might treat myself and allow a little bit of deeper tone to happen just in the core of this side as well. And then just take, and again, clean brush, and do the same process. Ever so lightly merge those shapes so they don't have hard lines. Clean and tap, clean, tap, clean and tap, and so on. And you know, just be patient. Again, I know I'm working quite fast for the purposes of this little demonstration, but you know, you can take as long as it takes. Please do that. You know, please don't. Sometimes some of the demonstrations we see on TV and whatever, that people fly through things, and I think it gives students a sense that, oh, you know, if it's not all flashy and quick, then it's no good. You know, you know, it doesn't matter how long it takes. Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael did not have time in their mind too much when they were really concentrating. They focused and got the job done, but they weren't trying to show off as to how quickly they could do it. Although they were under pressure, mind you, from the Doges of Venice, or not Venice, but the families of Florence, the Medicis, sometimes to get the job done. What I'm doing here is I'm just bringing up a little bit of light on that stem, you know, just to give it a wee bit of sheen. And actually what I might do is I think these veins could creep a little bit further out, maybe, you know. I'm now getting, you know, pernickety, but I'm getting fascinated with it, and maybe this is the time to stop. Probably is. So hopefully what you're seeing here is some method of creating form by following those words, you know, where are the shapes? What sort of tones do we have? What do the edges look like? Are they soft or hard edges, you know? And are there any other marks? Well, in this case, the only other marks really are the textures and things I'm putting in now, you know. But you can see as I'm putting those little bit of highlights, and it's creating a nice crinkly feel to the leaf on the outside and so on. And maybe if these lines seem a wee bit severe, what I'm going to do is just drag them with the clean brush so they fade back as they disappear out towards the outer part of the leaf. You see that they merge a little bit, and it kind of makes more sense to the structure of the leaf. Anyway, I will not torment you anymore with that. Hopefully that process will help you construct a leaf in this way. Have a go at this now. Do not worry whether it goes smoothly or not smoothly. Please just follow the process and watch what happens to the paint. And when you do that, that's when you will learn, because you discover when you notice what's happening. You need to be aware of what's happening all the time when we paint. It's not enough to just bounce something off quickly and think that that's great. You have to be able to answer the question afterwards. How did you do that? What did you learn from that? And if you can't really answer those questions, then probably you haven't been approaching the paint in the way you maybe should do, okay? So I know that you're all capable of brilliant things, so please give it a go, have fun doing it, and then let me see, send me the photographs, let me see what you've done, and I'll get back to you.